And now, my son, go thy way. Declare the word with truth and soberness, that thou mayest bring souls unto repentance, that the great plan of mercy may have claim upon them.
Welcome to the podcast, Truth and Soberness, declaring the word through Come Follow Me. Your hosts for this show are Jason Hunter and Jeff Hicks.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Truth and Soberness. Today we're doing a midweek show simply because we have some things that we would like to discuss that clarify and support some of the material that Jason has been researching and the numerous writings that he has done on the subject matter. And so we'll turn the mic right over to Jason and get started in today's show. Welcome, Jason.
Hello. Thank you. This show is going to really just go over covenant language and covenant titles. This stuff so permeates the scriptures and our own covenants that we make in the church, and sometimes I think we just don't recognize it for what it is. And so I think if we can learn some of these patterns and titles and languages, that we can take a lot of benefit from that. I'm going to this is coming from language. It's either called the Near Eastern Suzerain Vassal Covenant, or some people call it the Near Eastern Emperor Vassal. That's kind of what I prefer. Suzerain is kind of a foreign term for most people, but we all understand kind of what an emperor is. And so I'll just call it the Near Eastern Emperor Vassal Covenant, and to be even shorter, I'll just call it the Emperor Vassal Covenant. And then as we go on, I'll share some of the particulars of this covenant, and where we see it in our own lives, because we actually see this on a pretty constant basis, it turns out. I'll start by simply naming these things and defining them, and then I'll go into explaining it and showing where that is in the scriptures. But I think if I just come out at the beginning and just say what everything is and what it means, then we can kind of piece it together from there. So in this covenant language, we have titles like emperor, vassal, father, son, servant, friend. Those will all come into play. Some of the covenant language: good equals keeping covenant. Evil means breaking covenant. A woe is a covenant curse. Then you also have the opposite of that, which is a blessing, and that is based on keeping the covenant. To know means to be in a covenant relationship or to be identified with a covenant relationship. To remember is to be made aware of the covenant. You also have language like to be grafted in or to be adopted. That is to be made part of the covenant. To be made part of an existing covenant. To be cut off is to be removed from that covenant. And then you have some really cool language, this day or that day. This day means covenants are made. That day is when covenants are fulfilled. So that out of the way, if you want to simply take those definitions and then go search these things out on your own, you can do that. Or if you stick around for a little bit, I'll walk you through the scriptures, and I'll show you where we can find some of that.
Jason, I think it's really interesting. Maybe at this juncture, I would suggest that any listeners, especially in episodes like this, any listeners come to the show with a pen and notebook and write some of these things down. I do that, and I'm part of the show, because it's helpful to remember these things later on. I keep a constant running daily journal of things that I think about during the day, or in this case, things that I discuss with Jason regarding in this case, covenant language. It's very important. And from a Latter-day Saint church member standpoint, we're constantly reminded of our covenant path with our Father in heaven.
Yeah, and that covenant path is based on and defined by this same emperor vassal covenant language. And I think we'll see that here. So this reading the scriptures through certain lenses can be helpful. And one way I like to read the scriptures is through the covenant lens, meaning everything that I'm reading, I'm trying to see how it relates to a covenant and how it teaches us about covenants. And so that's the primary lens I like to look at through the scriptures. And I've often said that the scriptures are, quote, legally precise in how they lay out their language. And we'll see in different episodes and stuff how I'll pick apart a word or a phrase and show consistently through the scriptures how it refers to the exact same thing without fail. And so the prophets use words specifically. They don't use them as callous or as careless as sometimes we do. Like we might say good and evil to simply refer to something that is positive or negative. Well, in this covenant language, it means keeping covenant and breaking covenant, and that's it. It's not, it's not a judgment on somebody's moral character. It's saying whether or not you're keeping covenant, and that's it. So the language is important here. One of the big parts of this emperor vassal covenant language is a part of the covenant that I'm going to refer to as the covenant of obedience. Some people call it the Davidic covenant. Some people, I don't know that that's exactly right, because David is known for other covenants of like a never-ending dynasty. And Hezekiah is perhaps an even better example of this. But in this covenant of obedience, keeping the covenant provides you with protection from a mortal threat, physical danger, something that is threatening you literally and physically that you need deliverance from. And keeping this covenant provides that in miraculous ways. And so and it requires exact obedience. You can't fudge this around at all. It requires exact obedience, and so it's important that we. That's why I call it the covenant of obedience. But getting back to how this covenant language begins, you have the emperor, and he controls an awfully large plot of land. If he controls. Let's say that it, compared to the United States. So the emperor would control the land belonging to all 50 states. Each of those states would be run by a vassal king or a lesser king. And those vassals would covenant with the emperor that they would be faithful to him, obey all of his commands, and pay tribute to him. And they would even give their lives to the emperor if it required it. So let's say that Canada attacked the United States. All of the vassal states would then go to the defense of the emperor, and we would all pitch in, and we would all give our lives, if necessary, to the empire and the emperor. Well, in return, a vassal that was faithful in keeping all of the emperor's commands could count on the emperor coming to his defense if something happened to him. So let's say that for some reason Nevada wasn't under this covenant with the emperor, and here we are in Utah, and Nevada decides to come to war against us. Well, if we've been keeping covenant with the emperor, we can call him up and say, hey, Nevada's coming to war against us. We need some help. And if we've been faithful to our covenants with the emperor, he will, with the full force of the empire, come to our aid and deliver us from the mortal threat that is Nevada. And so we have these relationships and these promises to come to each other's mutual aid and to keep commandments and rules and everything like that. Well, the language for this is a vassal that is faithful in keeping all of the emperor's commands is said to, quote, love the emperor. And the emperor's faithfulness in return is also called love. Sometimes we see this as the Hebrew word hesed, and we've seen this mentioned in general conference, the last few conferences about faithfulness and covenant keeping. Well, the emperor always keeps covenant, and so he is full of hesed, or covenant keeping. And the vassals who keep covenant with the emperor love him, he then loves them. If you break covenant with the emperor, you are said to hate the emperor. And so as you see the scriptures where love and hate is used, it is in this context. In fact, in John 14:15, Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments. Well, that's exactly it. In a covenant sense, in the very strict language, if you keep his commandments, you love him. And so we see another example in Matthew. Matthew 6:24 says, no man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And so you hold those in parallel. Holding to the one is and is loving them, despising them is hating them. So you can only keep covenant with one emperor. If I were Utah keeping covenant with both Canada and the United States, it wouldn't work. Either I'm loyal to one or I'm loyal to the other, and it doesn't work both ways. We see the same context with the words good and evil. Good means obeyed or covenant keeping, and evil is breaking covenant. We see a very explicit example in the creation accounts with both Moses and Abraham. In the Genesis or Moses account, we see that God saw all things which I had made were good. So after each creative period, God looked upon them and saw that they were good. In the Abraham account, the wording is changed. It says, it was so as they ordered. The God saw that they were obeyed. So God saw that things were good. God saw that they were obeyed. Obey is good. Disobedience is evil or covenant breaking. We see an example of evil when the brother of Jared was chastised for failing to call upon the name of the Lord for so long. And it says in Ether 2:15, and the brother of Jared repented of the evil which he had done, and did call upon the name of the Lord for his brethren who were with him. You know, the brother of Jared is not an evil person as we tend to think of evil. He was a very righteous person, but he had failed to keep a particular covenant, in this case, calling upon the name of the Lord, and this was accounted to him evil simply because it's the definition of covenant breaking. And so good and evil are legal terms in the covenant. They're not judgments on a person's moral character. And that's kind of a hard hurdle to get over sometimes when we're reading these things, because we're so used to the context that we've lived with for so long.
Speaking of that, Jason, as you're explaining these terms and painting the picture that we all mentally create as we listen to these types of things, I couldn't help but go back to we all have this concept of especially when we're discussing terms that may be fairly new to us, or we're trying to expand our understanding. For me, that means I have to interpret everything into my own personal language, if you will. I have a master's degree in international relations, and I think on some level, when we talk about covenant language, from an IR standpoint, we're talking about treaties and how a treaty might be interpreted into this covenant language. And that's how I kind of see things personally. So as our listeners are trying to internalize these things. Perhaps I would suggest personally that they touch points with things that they already understand very well, and then incorporate those things in so that they make sense and they truly do expand your knowledge base.
Great idea. Yeah. Um, let's see. So vassals are originally seen as servants of the emperor. As they show their faithfulness to the emperor's commands, they're eventually adopted and seen as sons of the emperor, regardless of actual lineage. An emperor will bestow the title of son on his most beloved vassals, and they enjoy added protection and benefits from the emperor, who now becomes their covenant father. But a son must be willing to give everything to the father, and vice versa. And so, a lot of, as we see covenant titles of father and son, think of these as faithful vassals who have been elevated or ascended to a son level with the emperor. And I think you can see where this all eventually gets to, with God the Father and Jesus Christ being the archetypes or prototypes for this father-son covenant relationship. And we see these titles and relationships throughout the scriptures. Jesus Christ, well, in Galatians, we read, "Wherefore thou art no more a servant, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Christ." So, speaking of people who have done more than just the basics, they've ascended from a servant level to a son level. And he's saying that if a son, then also an heir of God, an heir of the emperor, in this case, adopted into the family of the emperor. Jesus later adds another layer to this and calls his closest partners friends, and explains the following. He says, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man layeth down his life for his friends. Ye are my friends, if ye do whatsoever I command you. Henceforth I call you not servants, for the servant knoweth not what his Lord doeth. But I have called you friends, for all things that I have heard of my Father I have made known unto you." So the disciples at this point have obeyed all of his commands. He's saying, "Ye are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you." And he's saying, I'm even taking you a step above that, because servants have no idea what about the business of the master. They're told what to do, they do it, they report back. That's it. But he's saying, I've included you in the inner workings. I, as the son of the Father, receive special instructions, and I haven't held anything back from you. I'm including you all of this because you are so faithful. You're no longer servants, but friends. We see that also in the Doctrine and Covenants. Joseph Smith is called servant, my servant Joseph, for the good first part of the Doctrine and Covenants. Later on, he becomes my son Joseph. The Lord refers to him as my son. Toward the very end of it, he starts referring to Joseph as my friend Joseph. And you see that kind of evolution from just becoming acquainted with the Lord and keeping those basic commandments as a servant to being proven faithful in all things and being adopted as a son, and then being included in all of the inner workings and being considered a friend. The word to know has historically been seen as like a euphemism for sexual activity. And honestly, there are a lot of instances in the Bible where that's the only interpretation you can come up with. But to know someone is to have a covenant relationship with them. When a vassal knows an emperor, they have an active covenant in place, and the emperor can vouch for or cover for a vassal that he knows. So let's say again that Nevada and Utah have some kind of a dispute going on, and I go to Nevada. I'm like, look, we need to figure this out because I know the emperor, and he's going to vouch for me, and he's going to be behind me if this comes to blows. So let's figure this out diplomatically. And Nevada can write to the emperor and say, hey, this Jason dude is claiming to know you. Do you know him? And the emperor could write back, or anyone in the court could look at all of the paperwork and see my faithfulness as a vassal and see that I'm not even a servant anymore. I'm considered a son. And they'll write back to Nevada and say, yeah, we know Jason and he's a son to the emperor. And that carries a lot of weight. And so Nevada's not going to try anything because they know they're going to have the whole force of the empire bearing down on them if they cross me. And so to know someone is to have that covenant relationship and to be known as a keeper of the covenant. We see an example of that in Mosiah 5:13, where he says, "For how knoweth a man the master whom he hath not served, and who is a stranger unto him, and is far from the thoughts and intents of his heart?" And so, how do you know someone unless you think of them often and you serve them and is not a stranger unto them? That word to know has that kind of intimate knowledge. We see it in the parable of the virgins, the 10 virgins in the New Testament, Matthew 25:11. When the unwise virgins are locked out of the feast, the Lord gives the reason for not allowing them in, and he answered and said, "Verily I say unto you, ye know me not." That's the Joseph Smith translation. The other one is, "I know ye not." Either way, it works because he's saying, I'm not in a covenant relationship with you. Or in other words, you're not in one with me and you're not keeping it. So you don't have any claim on the benefits of being in a covenant relationship with the Lord and Master. You're going to be locked out of the feast.
As you've been
and the
talking,
Lord is not saying,
Jason,
yeah.
that was the specific parable that I was thinking about, was one of my favorites, which is the 10 virgins. And I think that has incredible application, especially for all of us today, living in the latter days, and our concern for our relationship with our Savior, Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. And it's very applicable to us because all 10 of the virgins were waiting for him. They all knew about him. They all had some kind of foreknowledge of what was coming, but half of them were not prepared. Half of them were not keeping covenant with him. And when he showed up, he said, "You don't know me. You're not part of this anymore." And that's something definitely applicable to each and every one of us. In Isaiah, we see an example of this. Isaiah 1:3. The ox knows its owner, the ass its master's stall, but Israel does not know. My people are insensible. This is we see things in parallel here. Ox and ass. Ox is a clean animal that represents Israel. The ass is an unclean animal. It represents the Gentiles people. And it says the ox knows his owner, has a relationship with him. Even the donkey, the Gentiles, knows its master's stall. But then the Lord says, "But Israel does not know." And he says, "My people are insensible." He's not claiming. He's not angry about Israel's lack of awareness of God. They knew who God was. They weren't keeping covenant. And he's saying even the simple animals know who their master is and know where they belong, but Israel does not. It's all over the place. So as you start to see, go through the scriptures and see the word "to know" or "knoweth" or something like that, be thinking of covenants and covenant relationships. Let's see. We see another example of that with Joseph in Egypt, both for the term father and to know. So when Joseph first goes to Egypt, he's in the prison. He interprets Pharaoh's dream about the 7 years of leanness and the 7 years of plenty. And by interpreting that dream and telling Pharaoh, we've got to start preparing, Pharaoh puts him in charge of absolutely everything. He's like, the only person above you, Joseph, is going to be me. So in Genesis 45:8, it says, "So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God, and he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." Joseph is saying that he is now set up as the father in this covenant relationship, and Pharaoh reports to him, and then he will report to God. I'll identify this this covenant relationship here as how there's intermediaries and stuff, but we see that Joseph is a father in this relationship, and because Pharaoh hearkened unto Joseph, and everybody kept the commandments of each, Egypt was delivered. We see a miraculous deliverance, a physical, literal deliverance from a mortal threat of 7 years of absolute famine because they kept this covenant with exactness. Now, after we get down to like the Moses time in Egypt, we have another example of to know about the Pharaoh. It says in Exodus 1:8, now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. This is not saying that the king was not aware of who Joseph was, because Joseph was a national hero. He was second only to the Pharaoh. Everybody knew who Joseph was. This Pharaoh is not in a covenant relationship with Joseph, and we see how he treats the children of Israel at that point. That's what it means to not know Joseph. There's no covenant relationship there. There's no expectation of safety or security or deliverance to be expected. And so we get down to the part of this covenant language where it provides miraculous deliverance from a mortal threat. And this is what I call the covenant of obedience. We will see this throughout the scriptures, and I think once we start describing it, you'll recognize it everywhere. But the covenant of obedience is seen in these Near Eastern emperor-vassal treaties. And if there's ever any kind of like a national emergency, like I said, the emperor can count on all of his vassals keeping covenant with him. And so if any of them are in any kind of mortal danger, he will come to their aid. And what we're going to see is that God the Father stands in here for the emperor, and then we form different kinds of covenants underneath that, which provide for our deliverance in these situations. And we're going to see a really good example of this. But here's how it works. You have the emperor, who's all powerful. He's able to deliver no matter what. He's the one you absolutely put your faith in. You have an intermediary, and then you have those underneath. So you can sum it up kind of this way. Party A. So let's say that I'm going to covenant with you, Jeff, and then you're going to covenant with Father. You're going to be the intermediary. Here's how this covenant would work. I covenant to hearken unto you and to obey your commands as you hearken unto the emperor. And you will then covenant to hearken unto the emperor and obey his commandments. That's how it works. You have a three-party system, and you have you working as the intermediary. And in our case, we usually see the intermediary as Jesus, right? Jesus is the one that we covenant with. We obey his commandments. He obeys the commandments of the Father, and we receive deliverance. But we'll see it in a lot of different areas here. So,
Jason, how would and let's focus primarily in this situation on covenant people who have already made covenants with our Father in heaven. What would be a good example of how they would use that covenant relationship, that intermediary relationship, to bolster their spirituality, let's say?
I'll give you two examples. One comes from the Ten Commandments. It's the first commandment with a promise. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the earth. So this is the first one where, health, strength, protection, deliverance is promised to those who honor thy father and thy mother. Children are not capable of keeping God's commandments in the same strength and way that their parents are. Parents are much more spiritually advanced, or should be. And that in this case, the parents can give their children certain instructions, certain commandments, something that the children can keep and can obey. And as long as the children obey and honor their parents, and as long as the parents honor and obey the commandments of God, the promise is that thy days will be long upon the earth. And that's very simply summed up. But that's an example of this. Another one, and I'm going to skip down a little bit because I'm looking for the exact wording of it. Is with Jesus Christ, and we do this with the sacrament every week. We covenant to take upon ourselves in the name of Jesus Christ to remember him. Remember is a covenant term, and to keep his commandments that he has given us. And then we are promised the guiding and direction of the Holy Ghost. Well, in John 14:15, we read, Jesus says, if ye love me, keep my commandments. And you might think that they're the same thing as the Father's commandments, but they're not. Because in John 15:10, we see, if ye keep my commandments, ye shall abide in my love, even as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. Jesus is capable of keeping far higher and greater commandments than we ever could. If the Father required us to keep the same commandments that Jesus is capable of keeping, we'd be lost. But Jesus is the intermediary. He has given us his commandments, and they are a lesser law, but they're ones that we are capable of keeping. If we keep Jesus's commandments, and Jesus has already proven that he's keeping the Father's commandments, then we will receive those blessings. And we get to renew that covenant every week when we partake of the sacrament. It's a very empowering covenant once we know really what we're doing as we're doing that. And we can do that with all of these covenants. These are very personally applicable, and we can use them as parents. We can use them as just individuals as we partake of the sacrament. But knowing that we're in that kind of a powerful covenant with Jesus and with God the Father is life-changing, I think.
I love the thought of parents who are raising children, especially, and helping them understand that perhaps that little visual, if you will, of teaching a child that I'm your parent here on earth. I'm teaching you and helping you understand basic values and concepts and ideals that reflect a greater relationship with deity, through Jesus Christ and our Father in heaven, and doing that in such a way that is very easy to frame and understand on a spiritual level.
Yeah, and like you said, it can be taught incredibly early. Infants and small children, and even teenagers and people and kids in their 20s, they're just not capable of the same thing as somebody in their 50s and 60s. We grow and develop our whole lives, and so this is something that can be applied and tailored and tuned as you go. It can be modified to match your situation.
And like we've talked about in every episode, we're always trying to understand what value scriptures and teachings have in our own personal lives. And obviously everyone is different in how they view things and how they internalize these types of teachings. That's why we talked about earlier about speaking our language, so to speak. And we can interpret these things and then apply them as we see them in our own personal existence. And that's what's so wonderful, in my opinion, about the scriptures.
Agreed. Let me share a couple of examples of this covenant of obedience, of stories that we're all familiar with, but maybe we didn't put two and two together to figure out how they worked. So in the book of Isaiah, Hezekiah's father, King Ahaz, is in a situation where Syria is coming up to sack Jerusalem and carry away all of its inhabitants. Ahaz is a wicked king. He did not keep covenant with the Lord as he should have. And when he's confronted with Syria coming up to war against him, Isaiah tells him, look, don't do anything. Keep covenant with the Lord and you're going to be okay. Seriously, don't get involved. This will be okay. But Ahaz does not listen to Isaiah. And Isaiah's like, look, don't believe me. Ask for a sign from God and he'll give it to you. And Ahaz is like, look, I don't want to. I'm gonna contact the king of Assyria. So Ahaz makes a covenant with the king of Assyria. In 2 Kings 16:7, the language is, so Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am thy servant and thy son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Assyria, or king of Syria. So you have him petitioning the emperor, saying, I am thy servant and thy son. I covenant with thee. Protect me from Syria. And Assyria did that. They kept Jerusalem safe from Syria, but now Jerusalem was in a covenant relationship with Assyria and was a vassal to them and paying tribute and keeping the commandments of Assyria. And it was not always the best of circumstances. So when the time came when the king of Assyria died and a new one takes his place, that covenant's broken, and he's got to go around and get covenant relationships with all the vassals again. And so they come down to Jerusalem. This time Ahaz is gone and Hezekiah is in charge. And Assyria has 185,000 troops camped outside the walls of Jerusalem saying, we're going to take you. You're ours now. And Hezekiah goes to Isaiah and he's like, what do I do? And Isaiah tells him, keep covenant with the Lord and everything will be okay. And he was beside himself. In fact, he's almost on his deathbed. He's just sick with worry, but he is faithful to the Lord, and he trusted in the Lord. And in some of these scriptures, he's kind of petitioning the Lord, telling him in like Isaiah 38, telling the Lord just how faithful of a servant he has been. And he's saying, I have done this, I have done that, and I need the help of the emperor now. He's calling upon the emperor just like Ahaz did to the king of Assyria. Hezekiah is now petitioning the Lord saying, I have been faithful. I need deliverance. Meanwhile, the king of Assyria has sent an emissary out to try to convince the armies of Jerusalem to give up. So he's looking for some treason here. He calls them out and promises that they won't be killed, but that they'll be relocated and given their own lands, crops, vineyards, etc. And don't worry so much about us taking over. You're going to be okay. And here's where we see the language of the covenant of obedience. In Isaiah 36:21, this emissary has been calling out to all of these troops. And it says, but they held their peace and answered him not a word, for the king's commandment was, saying, answer him not. King gave them very simple commands, answer him not. They kept that, and Hezekiah has been petitioning the Lord, saying, I've been keeping your commandments this whole time. Now my people are keeping my commandments. We qualify for this miraculous deliverance. And that's exactly what happened. The Lord, through Isaiah, tells Hezekiah, therefore, thus saith the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shield, nor cast a bank against it. By the way that he came, by that same shall he return, and shall not come into this city, saith the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it, for my own sake, and for my servant David's sake. Speaking of Hezekiah. And it came to pass that night the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. So 185,000 troops died overnight, so that when everybody woke up in the morning, the entire army was laid waste. And that's the kind of miracle that Ahaz could have expected from the Lord a generation earlier, but didn't. And so he subjected his own people to servitude and vassalship to the king of Assyria. But Hezekiah and his men and his troops were faithful to it and kept that. Let's see. All right. Here's kind of an example of what King Benjamin announced in the Book of Mormon when Mosiah will be king. He tells the people to keep Mosiah's commandments as they had previously kept his. In Mosiah 2:31, he says, "As ye have kept my commandments, and also the commandments of my Father, and have prospered, and have been kept from falling into the hands of your enemies," so there's deliverance right there, "even so if ye shall keep the commandments of my Son, or the commandments of God, which shall be delivered unto you by him." So here we go, there's that intermediary there, the commandments of God, given to Mosiah, given to the people. "Ye shall prosper in the land, and your enemies shall have no power over you." And that's the promise, deliverance from a mortal threat. Keeping these types of covenants, the covenant of obedience, is not to secure forgiveness of sins or salvation or anything like that. It's deliverance, and it's deliverance from a mortal threat. The language is very clear in all of the examples. And so when you have that kind of exact obedience and that deliverance, it reminds me of Doctrine and Covenants 82:10, where it says, "I, the Lord, am bound when ye do what I say, but when ye do not what I say, you have no promise." That's the covenant language right there. If you love me, keep my commandments. If you keep my commandments, you'll have protection. If you don't do these things, it's up in the air. You've got no promise.
And for the days that we live in, and I'm talking about the latter days of when we're told, when it's prophesied that we will have difficulties, famines and pestilence and other types of things that we perhaps would be afraid of. That thought of deliverance is very powerful, and perhaps is a good incentive to try as hard as we can each day to do better.
Mm-hmm. Let me kind of wrap up with one more example from the Book of Mormon that is perhaps applicable to us for that very reason of being in the end time. We're going to be looking at Helaman and the 2,000 stripling warriors. As their society degenerated around them, and they had civil war after civil war and an invasion from foreign armies and all these things, they were called up to war. Well, the Nephites called as their captains men of God. I mean, these men had the spirit of prophecy and of revelation. They were prophets and high priests in their own right. And so Helaman is the commander of this particular army, and these young men were entrusted to Helaman, who was a righteous high priest and a prophet. And their protection was expected, and it says that their mothers knew it. Or it says that they knew their mothers knew it. And again, going back to know, this is a covenant relationship that their mothers have entrusted these children to Helaman in a covenant relationship, knowing full well that they would be protected. So they're in this covenant, and they have to be exactly faithful to the terms of the covenant at all times. Failing to do so negates the covenant. And it will, like I said, in the end time here, it'll come back again. We'll go to war, and we may very well see where some battles are led by a prophet of God, where, high priests and people with these kinds of righteousness will lead people miraculously into battle and have deliverance. Well, like I said, the terms of the covenant are set. The kids, the stripling warriors, had to obey Helaman, and Helaman, as a righteous high priest and prophet, was obeying the Lord. So he says, "Therefore, what say ye, my sons?" For again, he calls them sons, they call him father. We have covenant terms there again. "For as I have ever called them my sons, for they were all of you very young, even so they said unto me, Father, behold, our God is with us, and he will not suffer that we should fall. Then let us go forth. We would not slay our brethren if they would let us alone. Therefore let us go, lest they should overpower the armies of Antipas. But behold, to my great joy, there had not one soul of them fallen to the earth. Yea, they had fought as if with the strength of God. Yea, and they did," and this is key, "they did obey and observe to perform every word of command with exactness. Yea, and even according to their faith it was done unto them. And I did remember," again, a covenant term, remember, "the words which they had said unto me that their mothers had taught them." Again, the covenant terms and formula are just thick there. They're sons. He's the father. They knew, they obeyed with exactness, and throughout that entire thing, he numbers them at the end of each battle, and they're all still alive. Some of them were wounded, some grievously, but they were all miraculously preserved. And that's the kind of um, deliverance that we can expect in the end time if we keep our covenants with exactness. And luckily, like I said, we have an intermediary with Jesus Christ. The commandments that he gives us to keep are totally keepable. We can do that. We've not been given anything that we absolutely can't do. So we can keep his commandments with exactness and rely on him, or let's say a prophet of God is leading us on an exodus, or if we're led into battle, whatever it is, if we have a righteous leader who we know is keeping the commandments of God, and we can keep his commands, we can have faith in miraculous deliverances like this time and time and time again.
I'm so happy that you closed this discussion with that great story, the sons of Helaman. And for those who may not be familiar with that story, it's found in the Book of Mormon. And it's a great story. In fact, my mother, when I was growing up, always reminded me that if I could be like the sons of Helaman, and in the context of keeping covenants and just being a good person, that I would be protected. And I believed that. And for those who understand the end story, those sons followed Helaman into battle. There were 2,000 of them. And some were injured, but everyone made it out the back end of that battle and were still alive. They all lived. And what a great story.
Yeah, and like I said, we just this episode's already going a little over. Otherwise, I have so many more examples, but we can include that in the notes for this podcast. Some more of the examples, some more of the things taken from the scriptures. But I want to encourage everybody as they're reading the scriptures to look for these covenant terms, look for these covenant relationships, and start to see just how the scriptures are permeated with them, how full of this covenant language they are, and then start to see how we can apply that in our own lives. And like I said, perhaps the most common one that we see and the one that we use on a regular basis is the sacrament. Every week we are able to go and renew that covenant to remember him. Again, remember is a covenant relationship word. We remember him, we keep his commandments, and we receive the Holy Ghost as our guide, and it's powerful. It's so much more powerful than I think that we have acknowledged or have recognized up until now, and it's something we can do on a very regular basis. So that's my encouragement. Start looking through the scriptures for these terms and patterns, and start seeing how they apply to you, and see how maybe you're already doing some of these things, like the sacrament. We've been doing that covenant for our whole lives, some of us, and now we just kind of are starting to recognize what it is. And maybe there are others. Maybe we're keeping other covenants like that we didn't know, and maybe we can keep them more fully, and maybe we can expect and exercise faith in certain outcomes and deliverances or blessings if we're more faithful.
Thanks for listening to Truth and Soberness, declaring the word through Come Follow Me. This show was produced by Voice Right Media. Any reproductions or copying of any content of this show are strictly prohibited without the written consent of the owners.